Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the two-player game, 1960, The Making of the President, designed by Christian Leonard, Jason Matthews, and published by GMT Games, who helped sponsor this video. This game will have you recreating one of America's most notable elections. But as a Canadian, I can assure you, you don't need to know anything about American politics to claim the presidency here. You will, however, need to earn votes, sway the media, and ensure you've got the best arguments during the critical debates. And I'm going to show you just how to accomplish that. So get ready to kiss some babies, avoid gaffes, and join me at the table as we learn how to play. To set up, place the game board in the center of the play area where you'll find a map of the United States of America, which is divided into its various states and then grouped into four main regions by color. You've got the West region, which also includes Alaska and Hawaii. You've got the Midwest, the South, and the East region. These are the state seals, and you'll place one into each matching space with their silhouette side face up. It should look exactly like this once you're done. Each player will be representing either Nixon or Kennedy, and in the game, Kennedy is represented by the color blue and a donkey icon, and Nixon is represented by the color red and an elephant symbol. Some states will show a certain number of those candidate icons in this area, and for each one you place a matching colored cube. These represent the support that candidate starts with in those areas at the beginning of the game. It will look like this once you're done. Next, set each of these candidate tokens in their home states. Kennedy in Massachusetts and Nixon all the way over here in California. By the first spaces of the phase and turn track, set one of these white cubes. These are the issues tiles, and you'll set them on the matching spaces of the issues track here. The cards with this back make up the campaign deck, which you shuffle into a face-down pile beside the board, along with these, which make up the endorsements deck. In a nearby supply, organize the momentum endorsement and 2 event tokens. Now, I have mine in some game trays that I own, and if you'd like to get some of your own, you can find links in the description below. Each player now picks a side, either Nixon or Kennedy. You then collect the matching colored cubes and 2 momentum tokens from the supply flipped to your color, along with your candidate's card with its exhausted side face down. This is the political capital bag, and you'll take 12 cubes from each player and mix them into it. You'll also find a debates board, but we don't use this until later in the game, so you can set it aside for now. You may also find you have a couple of extra game pieces. These are just spares in case you lose any, so they can go back to the box. But otherwise, that's the setup. In 1960, The Making of the President, you'll be traveling across the country trying to gain support for your campaign by buying up advertising, media time, prioritizing the issues of the day, engaging in debates with your opponent, and finally, reaching election day, where you'll see who claims the presidency based on who gained the most electoral votes from each state. The game is played over 9 turns, and each is broken into 4 phases, starting with the initiative phase. Here, you move the turn token onto the next space of its track, and then each player is dealt the number of cards shown there from the campaign deck. And as you can see, this will normally be 6 cards, but in later turns, it increases to 7. You can always examine your own cards, but keep them a secret from the other player. And if the campaign deck ever runs out while drawing, just shuffle any in its discard pile into a new deck. Well, now it's time to make an initiative check. And to do this, you'll draw cubes from the bag 1 at a time until you've drawn 2 of the same color. This gives that player initiative. So in this case, I've drawn 2 Nixon cubes. So Nixon has the initiative. Now, any cubes that were drawn are then returned to that player's supply beside them. The player who won initiative now picks who will go first in the next upcoming activity phase. So we'll assume that Nixon picks Kennedy to go first. That ends the initiative phase, and now we move on to the activity phase. This is actually broken into 5 smaller steps here, and during each step, players take a turn resolving 1 card. To help keep track of this, each time the person chosen to go first plays a card, they first advance this token. So Kennedy advances this in our example, then plays a card. Then the Nixon player plays a card, and then this activity step is done. So Kennedy advances it again, plays their next card, and so on. On your turn, you'll pick one of 3 different ways to play a card. So let's go over each, starting with playing a card as an event. To do this, simply pick one from your hand and reveal it. The very first thing you resolve on a card played this way is the rest information here. Now, this is printed in red, and although red typically refers to the Nixon player, this rest value always applies to either player. So Kennedy playing this would gain 2 rest. Anytime you gain rest, you move that number of cubes from your personal supply in front of you to your candidate's related rest area on the board. I find it's very easy for new players to forget to collect their rest cubes, so make sure you do this before anything else on the card, because as we'll see later, your rest cubes are very important. I should also mention, the cubes, along with these endorsement and momentum markers, are not meant to be limited, so if you ever run out of them while playing, just use a suitable replacement. With rest collected, you now read the event text here and resolve it. In this case, it says the player discards any number of cards from their hand and draws replacements from the deck. Discards go into a shared discard pile. And once the effects of the event have been resolved, you remove it from the game like this. Or you could just put it back in the box if you like. Sometimes an event, like the ones we see here, will indicate that its effects last for the remainder of the turn. In that case, keep it in front of the affected player as a reminder, and at the end of the turn, after all the phases are complete, then you remove it from the game. We're not going to go over all the different events in this video as they're all unique, showcasing key moments from the election. But by the end of this video, you'll know enough to confidently resolve them when playing. That said, let's go over at least a couple examples. This event tells you to refer to the Kennedy icon. You'll find the candidates' icons in this area of the cards. Again, this one here is for Kennedy, and this is the one for Nixon. Sometimes an event will tell you to gain or lose momentum. You then gain, or return to the supply, a momentum token. When you collect one, flip it to your side, and we'll see how these are used a little bit later. When resolving an event, you complete its requirements as much as possible, ignoring anything you can't. For example, this says the Kennedy player needs to lose 3 momentum. But if they only had 1, this event can still be played. They'd just lose the 1 they had. Some events will show a labeled bar under their name that says prevention, election, or debate. These are known as persistent events that will last for the remainder of the game. When played, stack them into the related space for them here on the board so you can refer to them when required. Additionally, when you play a prevention event, also find and set the matching named token in the related area here. This acts as a visual reminder that the prevention's effects are active. In addition to their other effects, prevention events prevent other events from being played. For example, once this Dwight D. Eisenhower event has been resolved, the Eisenhower's silence card can no longer be played for its event. Moving on, some events will provide you with state support. This one, for example, gives the Kennedy player 7 state support anywhere. Spending state support is one of the key ways to win the game. And while there are other ways to gain or even lose state support outside of these events, let's take a moment right here and learn about this very important aspect of the game. A state will either be empty or contain some number of red or blue cubes, but never a mix of both colors. As soon as a cube is in a state, even just one, the state is said to be led by that player. At the end of the game, each player gains the token of each state where they're leading, along with the electoral votes it provides, as shown here. The player with the most total votes will win the election and the game, so you want to get your cubes on the board. Anytime you gain state support, like we see here, you follow a very simple process. If the state is empty, or it already has some of your cubes, for each point of state support you spend, you can add a single cube from your personal supply to that state. So here I've spent 3 points of state support. And just be aware there's no limit to the number of cubes you could have in a single state. If the state you pick has your opponent's cubes in it, then for each point of state support you spend, you instead remove one of theirs. So here Kennedy could spend 1, 2 points to remove these cubes, and then spend a third to add theirs, a fourth, and so on. Now, as soon as a player has 4 or more of their cubes in a state, they go from leading that state to what is known as carrying it. Carrying a state is very useful because if your opponent wants to remove your cubes from a state that you're carrying, they don't get to automatically remove them by spending their state support points there. They have to instead perform support checks with them. So here we have an example where Nixon is carrying Oklahoma. So if Kennedy wanted to spend state support here, they can't just remove cubes like they normally would. Instead, they have to perform these things known as support checks. And this means that for each state support point you would normally spend to remove an opponent's cube, you instead draw one from the bag. If you draw your color, as Kennedy has done here, you succeed. And if you succeed in a state where your opponent has cubes, then you remove one of them from that state, returning it to their supply, and the one you drew from the bag is returned to your supply. Now let's go back in time a little and say that when Kennedy was doing their support check, they instead drew their opponent's color. This means the support check failed. Nothing in the state will change, and this cube that was drawn will go back to that player's supply. This also means the next point of state support that I want to spend here would require another support check. But here's the catch. If you fail a support check, you can't just decide to immediately try again. Anytime you want to spend any amount of state support in a state that requires a support check, you must declare exactly how much you're going to spend there before you start drawing support check cubes from the bag. So as we saw, this card gives me 7 state support to spend anywhere, and I can divide this among multiple states, but no more than 2 per state. This means that if I was concerned I might fail a support check in Oklahoma, or if I wanted to have a shot at removing up to 2 Nixon cubes from this state, I'd need to declare up front if I plan to spend 1 or 2 state support here. Let's say I did declare 2 support checks. I'd then draw these at the same time and resolve them as normal. Here I have 1 success, removing 1 cube, and I have a fail that does nothing. So just to be clear, if I'd originally declared I would only do 1 support check here and had been successful, even though this state would no longer be carried, I can't now choose to spend additional state support to remove another cube, at least not with this card, as I'd already decided how much state support I would use here. On the other hand, in the future, if I target Oklahoma with state support, I can now remove cubes as I like, as it's not being carried. So as you can see, support checks are risky. You're not guaranteed to draw the cubes that you want. And it also means the more cubes you have in the bag with your color, the better. But the distribution of cubes in here is hidden information. A player can't peek in the bag. Of course, at the start of the game, you know there's 12 of each cube in here. But as cubes get drawn out, you're going to lose track. And you're not allowed to set your cubes off to the side so you can see how many you've drawn out so you know how many are left in the bag. You mix those all back in with the rest of the cubes. However, if both players agree, then its contents can be revealed. And then after you see all the cubes, you put them back in. Also, if this bag is ever empty, you stop and immediately refill it with 12 cubes from each player's supply. Going back to support checks for a moment, no matter how many or how few cubes there are in a state, you must perform support checks there if your opponent's candidate token is in that state. So if Kennedy wanted to spend state support in Tennessee, they'd have to perform a support check. And that would also now be true here in West Virginia, even though Kennedy is actually carrying the state. So just to be able to add more blue cubes to this area would require a support check. On the other hand, if an effect causes a player to lose or subtract state support, support checks are never required for that. You just take the cubes off the board. You also can't lose more cubes from a space than are on the board, and when losing support, the other player never gains support as a result. For example, if Kennedy was told to lose 3 support from this state, these 2 cubes would go back to the supply, and that's it. You don't add a Nixon cube to make up for the 3rd point that couldn't be removed. Okay, so that wraps up our detour into the very important aspects of spending state support and performing support checks, something you'll be able to do at other times in the game as well outside of resolving events. But to quickly refresh, we were talking about how during the activity phase, players go back and forth playing 1 card each. And one way they're played is for their event. However, you can play a card, ignore the event, and spend campaign points from it instead. First, just as you did when playing a card for its event, you move a number of cubes from your supply to your rest area based on the value here. Make sure you don't forget to do this. Then check how many campaign points, known as CPs, the card creates, as shown here. Campaign points can be spent on one of three different things: campaigning, advertising, and issues. Now we'll go over each, but just know you cannot split the points between those options from one card. They must all be spent on the same thing. So let's start by talking about spending them on campaigning. To do this, you simply spend the points as state support, exactly as we talked about before, except they must only be spent in states within the region where your candidate token is located. So here, Kennedy is in the East region, so the points can only be spent on any of these matching red states, divided as the player likes. Anytime a player spends campaign points to increase their state support, or they attempt to, spending them on support checks when required, you move their candidate token to that related state. As long as the state is located in the region you're already in, this move costs nothing. Just place your token directly there. However, if you wish to spend campaign points in a different region, or you just want to move to a different region, you pay 1 campaign point for each regional boundary that you cross. So to go from New York to Illinois means I crossed one regional boundary and I'd have to spend one of my campaign points. And then I could spend another to add one of my cubes there. Now let's say I wanted to travel from a state in the East region all the way over to a state in the West region. That will cost me 2 campaign points because I'll have crossed 2 boundaries. Here's another wrinkle. Alaska and Hawaii are also states represented on the board, and they're considered part of the Western region. But each also have their own regional boundaries that have to be crossed to get to them. And they can only be traveled to from the West region. So if I was over here and I wanted to get to Hawaii, it would cost 1 to get into the West region somewhere, and then another to go from here to Hawaii. And if I wanted to go from Hawaii to Alaska, I first have to go back to the Western region somewhere, and then go to Alaska. So going from Hawaii to Alaska would cost 2 campaign points. Just note, when campaigning with your points, you're free to split them between travel and state support as much as you like. So that's one way to spend campaign points on the card that you've played. Or instead, you can use those points to advertise. To perform this action, you make a number of support checks equal to the number of campaign points the card provides. So here, 3 support checks. And you draw these all at once. Let's say I'm the Kennedy player. Here I've drawn my 3 cubes. 2 of them show my color and count as successes, and 1 is a fail. So this one goes back to my opponent's supply. You now assign your successes that you've drawn, divided as you like, among each of these 4 marked advertising spaces. And these work similar to a state. In other words, if the space is empty or you already have a cube there, you can simply add more to it. However, if an opponent's cube is already there, instead, each success removes 1 of theirs, and then these cubes would just be returned to those players' supplies. However, unlike spending campaign points on state support, it doesn't matter where your candidate is located. So what's the value of having media support cubes in advertising? Well, remember how earlier I said that if your opponent is carrying a state, that is, they have 4 or more of their cubes in it, or if they have their candidate's piece in a state, then you must do support checks in those states when you want to add support there. Well, if you have media support in that region, then you do not have to perform support checks in any states within that region. So in a case like this, where Kennedy has media support in this region, that player can directly add their cubes to this state here without making support checks, even though their opponent's candidate is in that state as well. Or they could come up here and remove these cubes without a state support check, even though their opponent was carrying the state. Think of it this way. When you've got control of the media in that region, it doesn't really matter what else your opponent's been doing. You're now in the homes and the newspapers and the magazines, on the billboards that everyone in that area is seeing. That's very influential. So when spending campaign points, you can either campaign or advertise, or the final option, advance your position on issues. This is done on these 3 spaces of the issues track, and you simply divide the campaign points you're provided by the card you played among these as you like. And the issues are treated just like states in advertising spaces, in that each space can only contain one player's cubes. So if an opponent's were already here, the cubes you would add instead take their cubes away. The costs for this action, though, are a little different. The first cube you want to put onto an issue costs one of your campaign points. And each additional cube you would add to that same issue with this card costs 2 points each. So for example, let's say I wanted to add a cube to economy. That would cost me 1 campaign point. And since there's an opponent here, I would just remove their cube. Then the next cube I would want to add here costs 2 of my campaign points for a total of 3 so far. However, this increased cost only applies to an issue you already added a cube to with these points. So if now I added a cube here, that only costs me 1 point since it's the first cube I've tried to put on this issue from these points. Also, if it was a future turn and I was playing a different card, these costs would reset. So for example, the first cube I place here costs me only 1 point, even though there's a cube there from a previous turn. To add another cube there now would then cost me 2 points, which I don't have, so maybe I'd put a cube here. Leading in certain issues will benefit you later, as we'll see, and there's also events that impact the leader of particular issues when played. So when you don't play a card for its event, you instead spend its campaign points on either campaigning in the states, advertising in regions, or on issues. And then you discard it. Now, oftentimes you'll skip playing the event because it doesn't help you, it helps your opponent. However, after you've played a card, for any one of those other purposes, other than the event, the opposing player can still choose to trigger the event themselves by spending one of their momentum markers. So as the Kennedy player, perhaps I play this card for the campaign points. Once I'm finished resolving them, the Nixon player can choose to return a momentum token that they have back to the supply, and now they get to resolve this event, which is very favorable to them. Events that are favorable to a particular candidate will show their symbol here. And once the event has been resolved, this card is then removed from the game, just like any that are played as an event in the first place. Now, you might not want your opponent to be able to trigger an event on a card that you're playing, and you can prevent that. To do this, at the moment you're first playing the card for its campaign points, before you resolve anything on it, you may spend 2 of your momentum markers, putting them back in the supply, and this preempts the event, meaning your opponent cannot pay a momentum afterwards to trigger it. And then once you're done with the card, you just discard it. Now, keep in mind, your opponent does not need to reveal their intention to trigger your event or not. If you don't preempt the event and start resolving the card, then when you're done, your opponent reveals at that time if they're going to trigger the event. Okay, so we know that on your turn, you can play a card from your hand. And first, you move an amount of cubes from your supply to the rest area of the board, based on the value here. And then you either resolve its event or spend its campaign points. But there's also one other option. Instead of playing a card from your hand at all, you can play your candidate card. This always sits in front of you. You don't hold it in your hand. And using it means that you have 5 campaign points to spend for that turn, just as you would by gaining campaign points from another card. However, once you use this, rather than discard it, you flip it over to its exhausted side. And now you can't use it again until it's flipped back over. It will only get flipped back over as a result of certain events. So use your candidate card wisely. You may only get to use it once in the entire game. And those are all the different ways you can play a card in the activity phase. After the first player finishes, their opponent goes, and then this cube advances, and the first player plays another card, and so on until both have played a total of 5 cards each. Then you move on to the momentum phase of the turn. Here, both players must first discard half their momentum markers rounded down. So if I had 5, I'd return 2 to the supply. And this incentivizes using momentum when you have it. Now the player with the most media support cubes, totaled across all 4 spaces of the board, may switch the positions of any 2 adjacent issue tokens on this track. And we'll see why this could matter in a moment. If players have an equal amount of media support, then neither get to change the position of the issues. Either way, you next look at the issue in the 3rd place, and if a player has their cubes on it, no matter how many, they gain the 3rd place reward, which is 1 momentum marker. If a player has cubes on the second place, they gain one momentum marker or one endorsement card, and they must make this choice before the first place issue is resolved. Anytime you gain an endorsement, it means you draw the top card of this deck and resolve it. This will instruct you to place an endorsement marker flipped to your side into the related region's advertising space. This is the separate, larger circle next to the media spaces, and these follow the same rules as support cubes. In other words, if an opponent has an endorsement in one of these spaces already, and I gain an endorsement to place there, I instead just remove theirs, and mine's discarded as well. With the second place issue awarded, the first place is now awarded, and that candidate receives one momentum and an endorsement card. And then the final step of the momentum phase is removing one support cube from each issue tile, if any are there. Now we move to the campaign strategy and rest phase of a turn. If you are on turns 1 through 5, each person must now add exactly one card from their hand face down onto their campaign strategy stack, which is printed here on the board. If you're on turns 7 or 8, each player instead adds 2 cards from their hand to their stack, which will be possible because they're dealt more cards in these later turns. There are 4 cards labeled as gathering momentum in the game, and you are not allowed to add these to your campaign stack. So if you have one of these during your activity phase, you will likely have to use it to ensure you've saved a valid card to add to your campaign strategy stack. In rare cases, due to the effects of certain events, through no fault of your own, you may find yourself in this phase with only gathering momentum cards in your hand. And in that case, you won't add anything to your stack. You just discard these. Now, we'll see how these campaign stacks are used later, but remembering that you have to place cards here is an important part of managing your cards for each turn. Anyway, at this point, you will likely have no cards in your hand, but if you happen to have any, again, likely due to the effects of certain events, those would now be discarded. Over the course of this video, you've got shots of the board at different times, and you might have noticed that these rest areas have been empty. But remember, when you're actually playing a game, every time you play a card, it will usually provide you with some amount of rest cubes to add to these areas. And this is important because now both players put any cubes they have in their rest areas into the political capital bag. This means the more you are able to accumulate here over the course of the last turn, the better the odds that you'll draw your cubes during checks later. And that ends the turn. And now you move on to the next one, starting with another initiative check to see who will decide who goes first during that activity phase. And you'll continue taking turns like this until you get to turn 6, known as the debates. It's time for the candidates to debate their positions on the national stage. And this turn will follow its own totally unique series of steps, except for the very first step, which again involves doing an initiative check. However, the winner of this doesn't pick who will then go first. They just have initiative, and they'll keep that during the duration of the debates and also win any ties that occur. I should also stop and point out that any cards in this debate stack are now in effect, so ensure you read these thoroughly and apply them to the rules I'm about to explain. Now bring out this debate board and put the issue tokens on the corresponding spots, with the issue in first place going on the spot for first place, second place goes on to the second place spot, and yes, third place goes on to the third place space. And ensure that you transfer any cubes that might have been on those tokens along with them. Then each player collects the cards they stored in their campaign strategy card stack. And now it's time for the debates to begin. First, each player selects one of their cards, and once they're both ready, those are revealed simultaneously. All cards show the symbol for one of the 3 issues in this area, but also pay attention to the candidate icon it shows. The players now set the card they revealed beside the matching issue and on the side that matches the color of the candidate icon on the card that they played. For example, if the candidate player used this card, it shows the defense issue, but it has Nixon's icon, so even though Kennedy is playing it, it'll have to go on this side beside defense. Let's say the Nixon player revealed this one. It shows economy and it shows Nixon symbol, so it would go here. If the card shows both candidate symbols, the player can decide which side to add it to. And if both the revealed cards give players the options of the side to pick from, the person with initiative decides who places their card first. This process is repeated with players secretly picking a card from their hand, both revealing them and placing them on the debate board, until 2 cards have been played to the same side of a particular issue. At that point in the debate, the related issue is considered won by the player who has the highest total campaign points on their side of the debate. In this case, we have a total of 4 here for Nixon and 3 for Kennedy, so Nixon wins. If there's a tie, or if neither player assigned any points to the issue, then the person with initiative wins the issue. If, when the cards are played, 2 issues are ready to be decided at the same time, they're resolved in reverse order. So in a case like this, the second place issue would be resolved first, and then the first place one. Either way, as soon as an issue is won, you first return its issue token to the lowest position on the issue track of the board, along with any cubes on it. Then you discard any cards beside it, and the player who won the issue is now awarded a bonus of state support cubes to immediately place on one or more states of their choice. The first player to win any of the issues is awarded 2 state support cubes. The player who wins the second issue that is resolved adds 3 state support cubes, and when the final issue is resolved, its winner adds 4 state support. And no support checks are required for any of these cubes, even in states that would normally need them, like one that's being carried by your opponent. Once an issue has been won, no further cards can be played to it. So a player who reveals a card for an issue that's no longer on the debate track just discards it instead of placing it. Players will continue this process of selecting and revealing cards and winning debates until all 3 have been won or both players are out of cards. As soon as one of those outcomes occur, any issues that have not been won are resolved, again, from 3rd place up to 1st, if you have more than one to take care of. In these cases, just see who has the most campaign points on that issue, and they gain the issue's reward. If there's a tie, like we have here, even if it's a tie of 0, the player with initiative wins it. With the debate over, all campaign strategy cards, played or unplayed, are discarded, including any persistent debate events that were on the board. Play then resumes as normal, moving on to the 7th turn. And remember, at the start of these turns, you'll be drawing 7 cards each. And at the end of these turns, players will put exactly 2 cards into their campaign strategy stacks. And don't forget, gathering momentum cards cannot be put in here. At the end of the 8th turn, this means you should have 4 cards here. And then when you get to turn 9, it's time for the election. This is it, the big day. And this turn follows its own unique structure, which we'll go over now. First, each player counts how many media support cubes they have on the board, and then adds that number of cubes from their supply to the bag. So Kennedy would add 5 cubes, and Nixon would add a total of 3. Then you also collect the cubes on the media support spaces of the board and add them to the bag as well, along with any that are currently sitting here on the issues track tokens. The players then add 2 cubes to the bag for each momentum token that they currently have, and then they discard those tokens. You now perform an initiative check, and the winner will have initiative during the election. Both players now pick up the cards they have in their campaign strategy stacks and reveal them. For each of these, the player gains 3 support checks in the states indicated on those cards in the areas here. And the player with initiative resolves all their cards first. There are 2 key things to remember here. First, these are support checks, and that means even if the player would normally be able to just add cubes to the related state, like Kennedy could here in Georgia, they still have to perform support checks to hopefully draw their color and then add their cube to the state, or use their successful draw to remove their opponent's cube from the related state. Secondly, if the political capital bag runs out of cubes during this step, it is not refilled. And that means a player may not be able to perform all the support checks they're owed. And that's certainly one of the reasons why you'll want to go first in this turn. Once this step is complete, you now collect any election day events from this area of the board and resolve them in the order chosen by the player who has the initiative. After that, check every state on the board that has no cubes in it. If that state is part of a region with an endorsement marker, the player who has their endorsement marker there puts a support cube on those states. If, however, there are no endorsement tokens in that region, the empty states go to the player whose color is found behind its name here. So this state would go to Kennedy, and this one would go to Nixon. This means that when you're done, every state will now have one of the candidates' cubes on it. Then the players collect the state seal tokens from every state where they had some of their cubes, flipping them over. The values here represent the electoral votes you've won from that state, which will be the same value that you see printed with that state on the board. I've only collected 3 here for Kennedy, but Kennedy has a lot more to take from the board. But the point is, once you have all of the tokens, you will total their values together, and that's how many votes you've collected, and the player with the most votes wins. In the extremely unlikely event of a tie, which could happen if the unpledged electors event is played, the game goes to the player who won the largest number of states. And if there's somehow still a tie, the victory goes to the player with the most state support cubes across all the states. And if there's still a tie, then the victory goes to Kennedy. The game also comes with some optional rules, which you'll find in the rulebook, but those I'll leave for you to discover on your own. Also, I should point out that you'll find this handy summary of the turns, including the debates and election day turns, on the back of the rulebook for reference while playing. But otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play 1960, The Making of the President. If you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. But until next time, thanks for watching.